It started like any other day for the Johnson family. Mark and Lisa Johnson were simple people, hardworking but struggling to make ends meet. They had 2 young kids and barely managed to pay their bills each month. Life was tough, but they never expected it to get worse. Then came the lawsuit. A company claimed they owed a large sum of money. It made no sense. Mark had worked for the company years ago, but he had left on good terms. Now, out of nowhere, he was being accused of breaking a contract he didn't even remember signing. The amount was more than they could ever afford to pay. Lisa read the legal papers over and over, but the words made no sense. The legal terms were confusing. Their stomachs sank when they realized they had no way to fight back. They tried to find a lawyer, but every consultation ended the same way. The fee was too high. Without legal help, they would lose. Their court date was set. Mark and Lisa sat in their tiny living room, holding hands. Their kids played in the background, unaware of the storm coming. "I don't know what we're going to do," Lisa whispered. Mark sighed, looking down at the papers. "We have no choice. We go to court, and we fight. Even if we lose, at least we tried." But deep down, they both knew. They were walking into a battle they had no chance of winning. Judge William Carter had seen many cases in his career. Some were simple, some were complicated, but many left him frustrated. He knew the law wasn't always fair. Sometimes the people who deserved justice didn't have the means to fight for it. When the Johnson family's case landed on his desk, something about it felt wrong. He skimmed through the details, then read them again more carefully. A large company suing a former employee for a contract violation, one that was vague and conveniently unclear. He sighed. He had seen cases like this before. Powerful corporations using their resources to pressure regular people. Most families in these situations lost, not because they were wrong, but because they couldn't afford a strong defense. The day of the trial arrived. Judge Carter watched as Mark and Lisa walked into the courtroom. Their clothes were neat but worn. They sat stiffly, their faces full of worry. He could see the exhaustion in their eyes. The company's lawyer was different. He had a confident smirk, a polished suit, and an expensive briefcase. He had everything he needed to win. The Johnsons had nothing. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He was supposed to remain neutral, but something in him refused to look away. He knew he couldn't break the law. He couldn't take sides. But he also knew something else. If no one helped them, they didn't stand a chance. And that didn't sit right with him. The courtroom was silent as the case began. The company's lawyer stood first, speaking with confidence. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Mr. Johnson signed a contract agreeing to certain terms. He failed to meet those terms, and my client suffered financial losses because of it. This lawsuit is simply about fairness." Mark swallowed hard. He didn't even remember signing such a contract. He had worked for the company years ago, but there was nothing unfair or dishonest about how he left. Lisa squeezed his hand as he stood up. His voice was steady, but Judge Carter could see the nervousness in his eyes. "Your Honor, I don't believe this contract is valid. I don't even recall signing it, and I was never informed of these supposed violations." The lawyer smirked. "Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, Mr. Johnson." Judge Carter remained expressionless, though inside, he was watching carefully. The lawyer's confidence wasn't surprising. He was used to winning cases like this. He had the resources, the training, and the experience to make sure things went his way. The Johnsons had nothing but desperation. Mark tried to present his case, but without legal knowledge, his arguments were weak. He had no way of proving the contract was invalid. He had no expert witnesses, no legal strategy, and no understanding of court procedures. The lawyer's responses were quick and ruthless. Every time Mark spoke, the lawyer countered with technical legal language that left him speechless. Lisa tried to help, pointing out inconsistencies in the company's claims, but she was immediately shut down. Judge Carter watched it all unfold. He knew where this was heading. If nothing changed, this family would lose everything. He tapped his fingers against his desk, thinking. He wasn't allowed to take sides. But maybe there was another way. Judge Carter sat in his chambers that evening, staring at the case file. The law tied his hands. He couldn't interfere directly, but his gut told him this wasn't justice. This was power crushing the powerless. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Daniel, it's been a long time," he said. Daniel Brooks was one of the best defense lawyers in the city. He had built a successful career, but never forgot his roots. He had once worked for the public defender's office, fighting for people who couldn't afford legal help. "Bill," Daniel's voice was warm. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again. What's on your mind?" Carter hesitated. "I have a case in my courtroom, a family being crushed by a company with deep pockets. They can't afford a lawyer, they don't stand a chance." A pause. Then Daniel chuckled. "Let me guess. You need me to step in?" "I can't tell you what to do," Carter said carefully. "But if you are looking for a case that actually matters, this might be one." Another pause. Then Daniel sighed. "Send me the details." The next morning, Mark and Lisa received a call. A lawyer named Daniel Brooks wanted to represent them. For free. Lisa almost dropped the phone. "Why? We don't know any lawyers." Daniel only smiled on the other end. "Let's just say someone believes in you." Mark hesitated. It seemed too good to be true. But they had no other options. When they walked into court that day, they weren't alone. Daniel sat beside them, calm and confident. The company's lawyer looked surprised. He had expected an easy win. Judge Carter watched from the bench, his face unreadable. No one would ever know what he had done, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted the moment Daniel Brooks stood up to speak. He exuded confidence, but not arrogance. There was a calm, quiet authority in his movements that immediately commanded attention. "Your Honor," Daniel began, addressing the judge directly. "The opposing side claims my clients violated a contract, but there is no evidence to support such an accusation. The contract they're referring to is vague and inconsistent. In fact, we have proof that the signature on the document could very well be a forgery." The company's lawyer looked momentarily thrown off. He glanced at the document in his hand and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Daniel's words hung in the air like a weight. Judge Carter listened closely, giving nothing away. But he had already seen the look in the company lawyer's eyes. "Doubt." Daniel continued. "We also have testimony from a former employee, someone who worked directly with Mr. Johnson. They'll testify that no such terms were ever discussed, and that Mr. Johnson was always in good standing with the company." The opposing lawyer, now visibly nervous, jumped in. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness isn't relevant to this case." Judge Carter raised his hand. "I'll allow it. Proceed." The company lawyer's face tightened. The judge had granted the defense a chance he didn't expect. The witness Daniel called up was a former employee who had worked in the same department as Mark. The witness confirmed that Mark had been a dedicated worker and that no such contract violations had occurred. As the witness spoke, Mark's confidence began to grow. He was finally hearing the truth being spoken aloud in the courtroom. The weight on his shoulders, which had seemed unbearable just days before, felt a little lighter. Lisa squeezed his hand, her eyes full of hope. The company's lawyer tried to push back, but the cracks in their case were showing. With every new piece of evidence, it became clearer. The Johnsons had been right all along. Judge Carter sat quietly, his eyes flicking between the two sides. He wasn't showing it, but inside he was relieved. It wasn't over yet, but the scales of justice were starting to tip. The final day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The opposing lawyer had tried everything: accusations, objections, and even attempts to discredit the witness. But it was clear that the tide had turned. Mark and Lisa sat quietly in their seats, holding their breath as Judge Carter prepared to announce the verdict. They had been through so much, but they still couldn't quite believe what was happening. Every moment felt like a dream. Judge Carter's gavel struck, and the room fell silent. After reviewing all the evidence presented, he began, his voice steady. "The court finds that the plaintiff's claims against the defendants are not supported by sufficient proof." Lisa blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. Mark's heart raced. The judge continued. "The contract in question is found to be vague and ambiguous. The evidence provided by the defense is far more compelling. The defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, are hereby cleared of all charges." The room was still for a moment. Then, a wave of emotion rushed through Mark and Lisa. They could hardly believe what they were hearing. It was as if the weight they had carried for months was suddenly lifted from their shoulders. They looked at each other, eyes wide with disbelief. We won?" Mark whispered. Tears welled in Lisa's eyes as she nodded. They had done it. They had fought, and against all odds, they had won. But as they stood up, preparing to leave the courtroom, they turned to thank Daniel. The lawyer had been quiet throughout the proceedings, never drawing attention to himself, just doing his job with calm precision. But when they looked at him now, he was already standing, making his way toward the exit. "Thank you," Lisa said, rushing over. "We don't know how to thank you enough." Daniel simply smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a man seeking praise. "It was nothing," he said softly. "You had it in you all along." Mark and Lisa exchanged confused glances, but Daniel had already turned to leave. He wasn't looking for thanks. He was just doing what needed to be done. And then, as quickly as he'd arrived, he was gone. Life slowly returned to normal for the Johnson family. The weight of the lawsuit, the fear of losing their home, was gone. Mark and Lisa were finally free to focus on rebuilding their lives. They used the money they had saved for the lawsuit to fix things around the house. They painted the walls, fixed the leaky roof, and even managed to buy new furniture for the living room. It wasn't much, but it felt like a new beginning. The kids, oblivious to the court battle that had nearly torn their family apart, were just happy to have a stable home again. Mark and Lisa worked hard to give them a sense of security, and for the first time in a long while, they felt hopeful. But there was always one question that lingered. How had they won? They didn't know the answer. They never found out who had secretly helped them. The lawyer, Daniel Brooks, had vanished without a trace. He never took credit for the victory. He never asked for anything in return. The Johnsons tried asking around, but no one seemed to know where he had come from or why he had taken their case. Their victory remained a mystery. Mark often found himself staring at the letter from Daniel, the one he had signed before the trial started. It had simply said, "Someone believes in you." They could never figure it out. But maybe in the end, it didn't matter. Life went on. The family was safe, and that was all that mattered. They worked hard every day, grateful for the second chance they had been given. They found peace in knowing that there was someone, somewhere, who had cared enough to help them. As for Judge Carter, he continued his work. He didn't seek recognition, and he didn't want it. He knew that sometimes, the best way to help was to quietly ensure that justice prevailed without anyone ever knowing. And that's how it was meant to be.